Call 911 now before you go in that house. That's what the old man across the street said to me the second I stepped out of my truck. My hands were still shaking from the drive, but nothing shook me like what he told me next. Because the woman he was talking about, the one he said needed an ambulance, was my wife. My name is Gerald Simmons. I'm 61 years old. I spent 34 years running machines at a truck parts plant outside Louisville, Kentucky, and I've been married to the same woman for 36 years. I'm not a man who scares easy. But standing in that driveway in Knoxville, Tennessee, hearing a stranger me to call an ambulance, before I even walked through the front door, I felt something in my chest drop straight through the floor. This is the story of what my wife went through, what I found when I finally opened that door, and what I did about it once I understood the whole truth. It started 2 months earlier, back in May, on a regular Tuesday evening, at our kitchen table in Louisville. My wife Diane and I were eating dinner when her phone rang. It was our son Tyler, 29 years old, calling to say he'd landed a big promotion at his logistics company, one that came with a transfer down to Knoxville, Tennessee. He and his wife Vanessa had only been married about a year, and now they were buying their first house, a real house with a yard, in a new city where neither of them knew a single soul. Diane's whole face lit up hearing that news. She had always been the kind of mother who showed up, the kind who drove 3 hours in a snowstorm just to bring soup when Tyler had the flu in college. So when Tyler mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Vanessa was a little overwhelmed with the move and the unpacking, Diane didn't wait to be asked twice. She looked at me across my table and said she wanted to go down for a couple weeks to help them get settled, unpack boxes, set up the kitchen, maybe help paint a room or two before they got too busy with work. I told her that sounded like a fine idea. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most, I figured, and then she'd be back home with me, telling me stories about the new house and showing me pictures on her phone. I drove her down myself that first weekend, helped carry in a few of the heavier boxes, shook Tyler's hand, met Vanessa for maybe the 3rd time ever, and drove back to Louisville alone that Sunday night, thinking my wife would be home again before the month was out. I remember standing in our empty kitchen that first night without her, thinking the house felt too quiet, and telling myself it was only temporary. I had no idea that 2 weeks was about to turn into 2 months, and I had absolutely no idea what those 2 months would actually cost her. The first couple weeks, everything sounded normal. Diane called me most evenings, tired but cheerful, telling me about the paint colors they picked for the nursery because it turned out Vanessa was expecting, due in the fall. She talked about organizing the pantry, hanging curtains, taking Tyler's old dog to the new dog park down the road, and finding a little diner nearby that reminded her of the one we used to go to when we were dating. I could hear in her voice that she loved feeling needed, loved being useful to her son the way she'd always been since he was a boy. Around the start of week 3, though something started to shift, just slightly, in a way I almost missed, she started calling later at night, sometimes after 10, and her voice sounded flatter, worn down in a way I wasn't used to hearing from a woman who used to run circles around me at 60 years old. When I asked when she was planning on coming home, she'd laugh it off and say Vanessa still needed her for a little while longer, that the house wasn't quite finished, that Tyler's new job had him working late most nights, and somebody needed to keep things running. I didn't push much at first. That's not who Diane was. She never complained, not once in 36 years, not when her own mother got sick, not when we lost a baby back in our 20s, not through any of it. So when she brushed off my questions with a tired laugh, I let it go, because that's what she always did. Brushed things off and kept moving forward without ever asking for help herself. Looking back now, I think that's exactly what let this go on as long as it did. Nobody who knows a strong woman ever expects her to need saving. We just assume she's fine because she always has been, every single time before. By the middle of June, a full month after she'd left, the calls started getting shorter. Some nights she wouldn't call at all, and when I called her, Vanessa would answer the phone instead, telling me Diane was resting, or in the shower, or already asleep, even when it was only 8 in the evening back home. At first I told myself it made sense, a new grandbaby on the way, a big house still needing work, a daughter-in-law who probably just liked answering her own phone when it rang nearby. But then I started noticing little things that didn't add up right. Diane mentioned once, almost in passing, that she hadn't been able to get to the pharmacy in town for her blood pressure medication because nobody had time to drive her, and Tyler's new house sat a good 20-minute walk from anything useful. Another night she mentioned her back was bothering her from being on her feet so much, and when I asked what she meant by so much, she changed the subject quickly to ask about our neighbor's new grandkids instead of answering me. I brought it up to my brother Ray one Sunday afternoon over the phone, told him something about Diane's voice just didn't sit right with me anymore, that she sounded thinner somehow, even over the phone, which doesn't make any sense, I know. But you live with someone for 36 years, and you learn to hear things other people can't hear at all. Ray told me I was probably just missing my wife and overthinking things, that new babies made every family a little chaotic for a while. Maybe he was right. But a man knows his wife's voice better than anybody else on this earth, and mine was telling me something was wrong, even if I couldn't have told you exactly what yet that day. By the first week of July, I'd had enough of guessing what was really going on down there. Diane and I had our 36th wedding anniversary, coming up on the 15th, and she hadn't even brought it up once, which was strange, because Diane never let an anniversary pass without planning something small, even just a card and a home-cooked dinner. I decided I'd surprise her, drive down to Knoxville myself, take her to a nice dinner, and bring her home with me whether the house was finished or not by then. I didn't tell Tyler or Vanessa I was coming down. Something in my gut told me not to give them any warning at all. I called Diane's cell a few times that week just to hear her voice, and each time either Vanessa answered, saying Diane was busy with the baby's room or watching Tyler's cousin's toddler for the afternoon, or the call went straight to voicemail without a single ring. When I finally did get Diane on the phone one evening, she sounded so tired I almost didn't recognize her, and when I asked if everything was okay, she paused just a half-second too long before saying, "Of course, everything's fine. Don't worry about me," before quickly changing the subject to ask how my knee was doing lately. That pause stuck with me the rest of the night, playing over and over in my head. My wife had never once in 36 years needed a half-second to decide whether things were fine. I packed a bag that Thursday night, told my buddy Ray I was heading down for the weekend to surprise Diane for our anniversary, and set my alarm for 5 in the morning. Whatever was going on down in that house, I planned on seeing it with my own 2 eyes, not hearing about it secondhand through a phone that somebody else kept answering for her. The drive from Louisville to Knoxville takes a little over 4 hours if the traffic cooperates, straight down through the Kentucky hills and into East Tennessee. I left before sunrise that Friday morning with a cup of gas station coffee in the cup holder and a knot in my stomach that never once loosened the whole way down that highway. I kept running the last few weeks over in my head, every short phone call, every excuse, every time Vanessa answered instead of Diane, trying to piece together some explanation that made sense and made me feel better about the whole thing. I couldn't come up with one that satisfied me. Somewhere around Cumberland Gap, I called Diane's phone one more time just to hear her voice before I got there, wanting to surprise her at the door instead of warning her I was coming down that day. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail without an answer. I told myself she was probably just busy with the baby's room again, or out running an errand, or asleep because Vanessa said she'd been having trouble sleeping lately. I told myself a lot of things on that drive, most of them designed to keep my hands steady on the wheel and my mind off the worst possibilities. By early afternoon, I crossed into Knoxville city limits, my GPS guiding me through a neighborhood of newer houses, with young trees still tied to stakes in the front yards, the kind of subdivision where everything looks fresh and hopeful and brand new. Tyler's street was called Birchwood Lane, a quiet little loop with about 15 houses on it, and as I turned onto it and started looking for the house number, I had no idea that a stranger standing in his own driveway was about to change the rest of that day, and honestly the rest of my life, with one single sentence. I pulled into Tyler's driveway a little after 2 in the afternoon, right behind Vanessa's car, and I hadn't even gotten both feet on the pavement when I noticed an older man standing in the yard directly across the street, watching me with an expression I can only describe as pure alarm on his face. He was maybe 75 years old, wearing a faded ball cap and garden gloves, like he'd been pulled straight out of his own yard work by the sight of my truck pulling in behind Vanessa's car. Before I could even shut my door all the way, he was already crossing the street toward me, moving faster than I would have expected from a man his age and his stiff walk. "Excuse me," he called out. "Are you here for the Simmons house?" I told him I was, that my son lived there, that my wife had been staying with them for the summer while they settled in. His face changed the second I said the word wife, going pale under that ball cap. He stopped a few feet from me, looked back at the house once, then looked me dead in the eye without blinking. "Call 911 now," he said, "before you go in that house." My whole body went cold right there in that driveway. I asked him what on earth he was talking about, and he told me his name was Harold Briggs, that he'd lived across the street for 11 years, that he watched that house more than most people would think a man his age had business doing, mostly because he didn't have much else to fill his days since his own wife passed 2 winters back. And what Harold told me next, standing right there in that driveway with my truck door still hanging open behind me, was something I will never forget for as long as I live. Harold told me he'd seen my wife through that kitchen window nearly every single day for the past 2 months, and lately what he'd been seeing had started scaring him badly. He said he'd watched her out in the yard in the pouring rain a week earlier, no umbrella, pulling weeds because Vanessa didn't want to get wet, doing it herself in her condition. He said he'd seen her carrying groceries up the driveway alone, on a day so hot the local news had put out a heat warning for the whole county, while Vanessa sat on the porch swing scrolling through her phone without moving to help. He told me that just that morning, through the kitchen window that faced his own front yard, he'd watched my wife collapse against the counter, catch herself on the edge of the sink, and just stand there for a long moment with her hand pressed to her chest before she straightened back up and kept washing dishes like nothing at all had happened. He said he'd almost called an ambulance himself right then. But he didn't have a phone number for anybody in that house and didn't want to overstep on somebody else's family business without being asked. But when he saw my truck pull in with Kentucky plates on the back, something told him this was somebody who needed to know before walking through that front door like everything was fine inside. My hands were shaking by the time he finished talking to me. I thanked him, told him I was going in right now, and he grabbed my arm gently before I turned away toward the house. "Sir," he said, "I mean it, call somebody. That woman does not look right at all these days." He let go of my arm slowly, like he was almost sorry to be the one saying it out loud to a stranger's face. "I should have said something sooner," he added quietly, mostly to himself, shaking his head at the house behind me. I didn't have time to ask him anything else. My legs were already carrying me toward that front door before my mind had even finished catching up with what he'd just told me. I walked straight up that driveway and through the front door without knocking, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it thudding in my ears the whole way. The house was quiet except for the sound of water running somewhere toward the back of it. I called out for Diane, and when nobody answered right away, I moved fast through the living room and into the kitchen, and that's when I saw her on the floor. My wife was sitting with her back against the lower cabinets, one hand still gripping the edge of the counter above her face pale as paper and covered in a sheen of sweat despite the air conditioning humming steady through the vents overhead. Vanessa was standing a few feet away, arms crossed over her pregnant belly, telling her she just needed to drink some water and she'd be fine in a minute, that she always got dramatic when she was tired like this. I dropped to my knees beside my wife, and she looked up at me with an expression of pure relief mixed with something that looked almost like shame, like she was embarrassed I was seeing her this way at all. Her lips were dry, her hands were trembling in mine, and when I asked her how long she'd been feeling like this, she could barely get the words out clearly enough for me to understand. I looked up at Vanessa and asked her, as calm as I could manage with my heart slamming against my ribs, how long my wife had been like this. Vanessa shrugged and said Diane had been complaining about being tired for a few days, but she figured it was nothing serious, that older people just got tired sometimes for no real reason. I pulled my phone out of my pocket right then and dialed 911 without asking anybody's permission or opinion on the matter at all. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, and by then Diane's breathing had gotten shallow and quick, her skin cold to the touch despite the summer heat pressing outside the windows. The paramedics worked fast, checking her blood pressure, hooking her up to a monitor, asking her a string of questions she could barely answer clearly. One of them, a young woman named Paramedic Diaz, asked when Diane had last eaten a full meal, and my wife, in a voice so small I almost didn't recognize it as hers, said she couldn't quite remember, maybe yesterday morning, because there hadn't really been time with the baby's room needing painted and dinner needing made every single night for everyone else. Diaz asked about her blood pressure medication next, and Diane admitted she'd run out almost 3 weeks earlier and hadn't been able to get a ride into town to refill it at the pharmacy. My stomach turned over hearing that admission, because I knew that medication kept her heart rhythm steady, and 3 weeks without it was not a small thing for a woman her age to go through quietly. They loaded her onto the gurney and into the ambulance, and I told Vanessa I'd follow behind in my truck. That she should call Tyler at work right now and tell him to meet us at the hospital immediately. Vanessa stood in the driveway with her arms still crossed, looking more annoyed than afraid, and said something about how this whole thing was probably an overreaction, that Diane got worked up over nothing sometimes when she felt sorry for herself. I didn't answer her at all. I just got in my truck and followed that ambulance through the unfamiliar streets of Knoxville, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white, praying the whole way that I hadn't gotten there one single day too late for my wife. At the hospital, a doctor named Dr. Patel sat me down about an hour later and explained what they'd found after running their tests. Diane was severely dehydrated and malnourished, her blood pressure dangerously high without her medication, and her heart had been under real strain for what looked like several weeks, running without any relief at all. He said if I hadn't gotten her there when I did, gotten fluids and medication into her system in time, she could have had a serious cardiac event within days, maybe even hours. He asked me gently if I knew what had been going on at home the past couple months, because a woman in Diane's condition didn't get this way overnight by accident. I sat with her that evening, once they had her stable and resting, an IV in her arm and a little color slowly coming back into her cheeks, and I asked her straight out to tell me everything, no softening it for my sake at all. What she told me broke my heart clean in two. She said what started as helping unpack boxes had slowly turned into cooking every meal, cleaning the entire house top to bottom, doing all the laundry, and once Vanessa got further along in her pregnancy, running every errand on foot, because Vanessa said she was too tired to drive her anywhere. And Tyler was always working late at the office. She said Vanessa had started saying things like, how could she possibly leave now with the baby coming so soon? How selfish would that look to the rest of the family? Until Diane genuinely believed leaving meant abandoning her own unborn grandchild completely. She said. She stopped mentioning how tired she was because every time she did, Vanessa made her feel like she was being difficult, or lazy, or ungrateful for the free place to stay that whole summer, and eventually it was just easier to stay quiet and keep working than to fight about any of it. I asked Diane the question that had been sitting in my chest, like a stone, since I walked through that door earlier. I asked her why she never once called me and told me the truth about what was happening. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she didn't want to cause trouble between me and Tyler, that she kept telling herself it would get better once the baby arrived. Once things settled down, once Vanessa wasn't so overwhelmed anymore with everything new. She said Vanessa had started keeping her phone charger in their own bedroom, so Diane's phone would die by evening most days, and she'd have to ask permission to charge it, which somehow always felt awkward enough that she just stopped asking most nights entirely. When Tyler finally arrived at the hospital that evening, straight from work still in his shirt and tie, I watched his face go through shock, then confusion, then something that looked a lot like guilt as the doctor repeated what he'd told me earlier about dehydration and weeks of physical strain on her body. I asked Tyler directly if he'd noticed his own mother losing weight, going quiet at dinner, disappearing to bed earlier every night than usual. He admitted quietly that he had noticed some of it, but Vanessa always had an explanation ready for him, and he'd been so buried in his new job that he just trusted his wife's version of things without ever asking his own mother directly himself. That answer sat heavy in that hospital room between all of us. My son hadn't meant to let this happen to his own mother, but not meaning to isn't the same as not letting it happen, and somebody in that house had let my wife nearly work herself into a hospital bed, while everybody else just called it helping out for the summer. Diane stayed in the hospital 3 days before the doctors cleared her to travel home again, and the moment they did, I packed her bag myself and told her we were going home to Louisville. No discussion needed on the matter at all. Tyler tried apologizing outside her hospital room, saying he'd talk to Vanessa, that things would be different going forward. But I told him plainly that talk doesn't undo 3 weeks without blood pressure medication or 2 months of a woman being worked like hired help while everybody called it family helping family. Here's what Tyler and Vanessa didn't know yet that afternoon. Back when they bought that house in Knoxville, Diane and I had given them $20,000 toward the down payment, structured properly through a lawyer as a documented loan rather than a simple gift, interest-free but due in full within 5 years. Mainly because a financial advisor friend of mine had always told me a paper trail protects everybody in a family, especially the people generously giving the money away. I called that same lawyer the week after we got Diane safely home, and I asked him to send Tyler formal written notice that the loan was now being called due in full, effective immediately, exactly as the paperwork we'd all signed together years earlier allowed me to legally do. I also called my own attorney separately that same week and had every bit of financial support I'd quietly been sending them each month for utilities, and the baby's nursery cut off completely and permanently. No explanation needed beyond what they already knew had happened in that kitchen. Diane didn't ask me to do any of this. I made those calls on my own, sitting at our kitchen table back in Louisville, because I knew if I waited to discuss it with her first, she'd probably talk me out of it, out of guilt over Tyler. Some decisions a husband just has to make quietly and stand behind afterward. The phone calls started within a week of that letter going out. Tyler called first, panicked, saying they couldn't possibly come up with $20,000 on such short notice, that this would put real strain on the mortgage, maybe even force them to sell the house entirely. I told him calmly that I understood completely, and that maybe it was worth asking Vanessa's own family for help this time around, since apparently my wife's help hadn't counted for much once she got too tired to be useful anymore around that house. Vanessa called 2 days after that, her voice sharp and defensive at first, insisting she never meant for things to get that bad, that she just needed help with the pregnancy and didn't realize how run down Diane had actually gotten over those weeks. I told her plainly that a woman doesn't accidentally go 3 weeks without her blood pressure medication in somebody else's house, unless nobody around her was paying attention on purpose the whole time. She went quiet after that comment, with nothing left to say back to me. Word got around the family fast, the way it always does eventually, and Diane's sister called to say she couldn't believe what Vanessa had let happen right under that roof, and even my brother Ray, who'd told me back in June I was probably overthinking things, called to apologize for not taking my worry more seriously back then. Tyler ended up refinancing part of the house to cover the loan repayment on schedule, exactly like the paperwork required of him. And last I heard, he and Vanessa were still working through some hard conversations about what almost happened to his own mother under his own roof that whole summer. Diane didn't ask me to soften any of it for Tyler's sake, either, which honestly surprised me a little. She just said he needed to feel the weight of it the same way she'd felt it, alone in that kitchen. And I think she was right about that. Diane recovered slowly over that following month back home in Louisville, her color returning day by day, her appetite coming back steady, her laugh sounding like her own laugh again, instead of the tired, flat version I'd been hearing on the phone all summer long. On the evening of what would have been our missed anniversary dinner, I took her out to the same little steakhouse we went to on our first anniversary 36 years earlier, back when neither of us had 2 dimes to rub together. Somewhere between dinner and dessert, she reached across the table, took my hand in both of hers, and thanked me for showing up when I did, for not waiting one more single day to make that drive down south. I told her the truth, that a stranger named Harold Briggs, standing in his own front yard, was the real reason I hadn't waited any longer. That if he hadn't crossed that street and stopped me before I walked through that door, I might have believed whatever story Vanessa was ready to tell me, same as everybody else had for 2 straight months running. We drove down to Knoxville together a few weeks later, not to visit Tyler, just to knock on Harold's door and thank him properly in person, bringing him a pie Diane baked herself and a standing invitation to call us directly, day or night, if he ever needed anything at all from us. Tyler and Vanessa are still working through what that summer cost them, in more ways than just the money involved. That part is between the two of them to figure out now on their own. As for me and Diane, we learned something that summer that 36 years of marriage hadn't quite taught us yet, that love shows up every single time, no matter what excuse gets offered at the door, and that sometimes the people who save you aren't even family at all, just a neighbor across the street who happened to be watching through the right window at exactly the right time.